Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're going to let everybody join us. Hey. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar from COP to Climate Action Plans, Elevating Early Childhood Within Climate Advocacy. I'm Brett Weissel. I'm the Global Policy and Advocacy Lead at ECDAN. And just quickly to begin, we're at a really critical moment in time when it comes to climate change. We've seen the impacts of climate change become increasingly quantifiable. We've seen rising temperatures, increased frequency of these severe weather events, significant disruption to agriculture production, displacement, migration. All these things are impacting young children and their families. And we know young children are particularly vulnerable to these impacts. We also know that investing in early childhood policies and service offers a solution. It builds individual resilience and community resilience and improves a host of outcomes from health and education, reducing poverty, et cetera. You as ECD stakeholders know all of this, but that's why your voice is so important to the climate agenda and to the climate conversation. And that's why we wanted to organize this webinar, to unpack some of these questions and issues and challenges and entry points for advocacy. And so with that, we have a terrific webinar ahead of us. We've got a great panel. So let me please introduce you to the chair of ECDAN's Global Policy and Advocacy Advisory Group, or GPAG, Joan Lombardi. Over to you, Joan.
Thanks, Brett, and thanks for everything you're doing and everybody around the world. We're seeing more and more activity happening to try to connect climate and the issues facing young children. So we're really excited that all of you are here. We know that many of you are already involved in very different types of advocacy. Some of you are collecting evidence and raising awareness. Others are encouraging the greening of early childhood. Others are involved in national or local planning. And some of you are also involved in global efforts around climate change. We're going to focus on all of that today. We have two presentations. We're excited to hear about some of the global efforts that are taking place around the world. And then we're going to have a panel and then come back and talk specifically about the road to COP30. So with that, I am really excited to introduce a pioneer in this effort, Adrian Cerezo, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Maine and also an advisor to the Pacific region on the intersection between climate and early childhood. Adrian, thank you for your leadership and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for this opportunity to reach out and talk with more of you. It is really heartening to see how much this community at the intersection of ECD and climate change is growing. That can only be a good thing. Brett is going to help me with my slides. I am coming to you today from the mountains in Wyoming, so my internet is sketchy at best. So what I want to do today is to give you an overview of the state of the negotiations in terms of climate change as related to early childhood development, and to point to a new development that is happening in the Pacific that I think should be pointing the way to what the ECD community should be doing in the year ahead of us. And I will try to do that in 10 minutes, so wish me luck. Okay, so to give you an overview, I want to go back one slide. I want to point out First of all, sort of the state of the negotiations. And in 2023, the Secretary General of the United Nations said our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once. Then in 2024, he said, we cannot accept a future where the rich are protected in air-conditioned bubbles while the rest of humanity is lashed by lethal weather in unlivable lands. But more importantly, he said climate finance is not a favor. It is a fundamental element to a livable future for all. And then in 2025, beginning the year, as he was giving an overview of where we're going, he said, um, the battle for 1.5 degrees, which is the amount of temperature that is safe to go above right now. And so vulnerable countries, especially low-lying islands, are trying to make sure that the temperature doesn't go above 1.5 degrees centigrade as an average globally. We already surpassed that, but never mind. Cannot be won with a fast, fair, without a fast, fair, and funded fossil fuel phase out worldwide. We must deliver on climate change, climate finance across the board, including through international finance architecture reform. And I want you to remember those words, financial architecture reform, because this is key to what is about to happen with the climate space. Next slide. What we know and what I've been working on in the last 15 years now is the fact that policies and programs focused on the early years provide a cost-effective, comprehensive, immediate, and enduring path to promote climate, human potential, climate resilience in communities, and sustainable development. We also know, next, that in order to deliver on that promise of a sustainable future that early childhood development policies and programs can provide, we must have programs that are well financed, high quality, equitable, and delivered at the right time for the right duration. This is all things we know in the ACD community. The reason I'm pointing this out is because we need to remember that when we're coming into the climate negotiations, the climate negotiations are at a crisis point right now. They need to solve a lot of problems with very little money and very little time. We need to highlight the fact that we're coming into the negotiations with tools, not just with problems. I know we are very anxious about the level of vulnerability that climate is creating for young children and families, but we have to understand that from a policy perspective, and from a climate policy perspective, we are one of the most endowed approaches to addressing climate resilience there are. Because with the same amount of money, we are creating human development, we are creating communities that are resilient, and we are promoting the sustainable development goals. What we need in order to do that is appropriate financing. And in multiple countries, that financing is financing to reach 100% of coverage. Every child that needs it gets some support so that they can be resilient, their communities can be resilient, etc. Next slide. The Pacific region has been a pioneer in this area. And in 2023, they adopted, and we've been working together since 2019. In 2023, they adopted as part of their Pacific Regional Council for Early Childhood Development an action point they're calling Action Point 10. It's part of their large approach to early childhood development policy in the Pacific region for 15 countries. Their flags are here. Action Point 10 says ECD is a pathway to increase resilience and adaptive capacity of communities to the effects of climate change. Next. No, before that. Okay, that one. As you can see, those flags that I'm highlighting, these are countries that have modified or created national early childhood development policies that have some version of this statement in their policy. And this is really important because what they are saying is early childhood development is vulnerable to climate change, but early childhood development policy is a key piece of the puzzle, an amazingly important tool in the creation of climate resilience in these countries. And therefore, we need collaboration between the climate sector and the early childhood development sector to make the most of this potential that ECD can bring. Next slide. Of note is the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which has been working since 2019 to create a national early childhood development policy that you can access online, and it specifically talks about this connection between early childhood development and climate change. Next slide. It also included, because of this collaboration between the Climate Directorate, which is what I work with in the climate negotiations, and the early childhood development sector, it has created the conditions for the first time in history, climate change, the climate change national determined contribution document for the Marshall Islands to include early childhood development in 2 paragraphs. And this is the first country to do so, but many countries are moving forward to do the same. And it says the fundamental role of early childhood development plays in the context of socioeconomic development and climate change policies to create the grounding for financing. Next. Also of note is the government of Samoa, which just adopted their national early childhood development policy, and their early childhood development policies specifically talks about employing the climate change financing facilities, such as the Green Climate Fund, to resource ECD, not resource ECD climate-related programs, to resource the nurturing care framework of all children, to reach 100% coverage for all children and families that need support in early childhood development so that we can capture this return on investment. Next. It is also of note that the Marshall Islands, through their delegation, made a statement in the first ever expert dialogue on childhood and climate change last year in the mid-year meeting in Bonn. And in this meeting, we emphasize once again that the earliest years of life, particularly from the first 3 years, are not only the most vulnerable, but also represent a pivotal window of opportunity that has to be financed in order to reach success. Next slide. Now, moving on to this year, and this is where it gets really interesting. The climate negotiations are basically have reached a point of saturation. There is an agreement with the parties, the participants in the climate negotiations, that they are not going to take on any new topics that are not already on the table in the negotiations. And therefore, we have to find out creative ways of including the topic of early childhood development and the financing of early childhood development. It is also true that vulnerable countries are resisting the efforts to include new topics in the climate financing mechanisms because they feel like the climate financing mechanisms are basically creating policy by proxy by telling countries this is what we will finance and this is what we will not finance. And therefore, what the vulnerable countries are asking for and what is going to be proposed at this year's Pacific Regional Council Forum, which is happening in a few days, I'm heading to Samoa to be part of it, is that they are asking, and this is what I am asking from you, that organizations that support early childhood development and childhood in the climate negotiations support the efforts of climate vulnerable nations to ensure that there is in fact this realignment of the architecture of the financing system so that climate financing becomes more flexible, accessible, equitable, and sustained for vulnerable countries. That means vulnerable countries will have the possibility of determining how they want to use their money, and the climate financing mechanisms make basically a block grant to countries for countries to use however they feel is most important to them. The second part of this puzzle is what we have been doing in the Pacific, which is we work at the national level with governments to elevate the connection between ECD and climate change so that they create national policies that then tie the financing of climate to the financing of the nurturing care framework. So in the statement this year, we're asking governments to continue to develop and strengthen comprehensive ECD policies and programs that are interwoven with climate resilience and adaptation. Next. So basically the way it works, not that one. The way it works is that we are going to, the ECD supporting and the childhood supporting organizations are going to continue working in the climate negotiations and to use ECD as an example of why we need flexible, accessible, equitable, and sustained financing. We're going to keep working with all the countries that we can to make sure that national policies interweave early childhood development and climate change, with early childhood development as a key point of value in creating climate resilience and climate adaptation and sustainable development, so that all of that drives the financing for what our goal is, which is 100% coverage of every child and family that needs support all over the world in order to gain the most benefit from these early childhood development policies for the benefit of climate change. Next slide. And so we want to ensure that ECD is seen as a supportive of overarching climate goals and positioned within the climate finance priorities. And next. And so here's what I want you to understand. Again, I know we're very anxious. This is all a catastrophic situation regarding climate change right now, especially with the changes in the US administration. But we have amazing capacity to bring into resolving the climate resilience issue. And every child born is a new opportunity to move towards sustainable development. We are a really important piece of the puzzle, and we have to come into the negotiations understanding this, because right now there is no space for coming into the negotiations to bring another problem. They have no space for new problems. They have a lot of space for new solutions, and we're one of them. And we need to think, moving forward in the COP process, how do we project our voice to let the negotiators know that ECD is one of the solutions that they have been looking for. I'll stop there. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Joan, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Adrienne. I really want to underscore some of the points that you made before we turn to our next presentation. And particularly that already we're seeing examples of countries integrating early childhood into their climate policies. We're going to be collecting those. And if those of you who are joining, we have many countries represented around the world on the webinar, want examples to look at as you advocate for your own policies, we can make those linkages. So thank you, Adrienne, for making sure that we stand up for young children and make sure that climate financing is also going to direct services for early childhood. I want to now turn to our next presenter, Jess Cook, who's a senior climate change and education advisor for Save the Children. Over to you, Jess.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. A really exciting webinar. And I'm going to be speaking a little bit more now around the national climate policy processes and how these link with the COP and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but specifically some of the entry points for ECD advocates to get involved in this process. So just on the next slide, here are some of the reasons why, for me, national climate policies are important for us to engage in. One of these is around finance. So when we're looking at climate finance, you're much more likely to secure climate finance if the sector that you're working on is included in those national policies. So if ECD is included within a nationally determined contribution or a national adaptation plan, is much more likely to be able to then, for that country to access international climate finance mechanisms. Linked to that is also the ability to then secure additional resources, which might be in the form of capacity, finance from other sources, or other forms of support and resources. Thirdly, looking at implementation. So if ECD is included in national climate policies, this can then guide kind of national implementation and integration into sector planning, sector budgets, sector policies, etc. And then also really looking at raising the importance and awareness of ECD as a crucial sector that can advance climate action, as Adrian just mentioned now. So have these in mind as we now go through a couple of the different climate policy processes. So on the next slide, you can look at what a nationally determined contribution is. And maybe you've seen this acronym before of an NDC. And an NDC is really looking at a country's self-determined national pledge to both reduce the rate of climate change, so looking at climate mitigation, and also adapt to climate change, so looking at climate change adaptation. And this can also include things like addressing climate-related loss and damage. And these are the types of impacts from climate change that are no longer avoidable and that are very difficult or unable to adapt to. So an NDC is a really important mechanism, and all countries who have signed up to the Paris Agreement is required to produce an NDC. And on the next slide, you can see why this is so important. So this year is a key year for the NDC updates. And on the right, hopefully you can see a little bit here, but some of the key dates in the process of NDC development. So the Paris Agreement was endorsed in 2015. And at that time, countries were required to submit their first NDCs. So looking at their first country-driven priority areas to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. Every 5 years, these are meant to be updated to become more ambitious in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement to stick below 2 degrees warming and ideally below 1.5 degrees warming. In 2023, there was the first global stocktake, which basically looked at all of these NDCs across the world to see where we are on track on climate change. And it was found that currently the NDCs that we had at that time are not on track to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. So 2025, the year we're in now, is a really key year because it's the next time the NDCs are updated. They're updated every 5 years. They were meant to be submitted in February. We haven't received all of them. September is looking like the next big month. But ideally, they're going to be before COP30, which will be taking place in November in Brazil. So there is a very small window of opportunity right now where countries are updating these NDCs, they're holding workshops, they're bringing together different sectors to really try and scale up their ambition to meet those Paris Agreement goals. As I mentioned, some have already been submitted, so have a look and see if your country has submitted one. Otherwise, there might still be opportunity to engage. And at the end of my presentation, I can share a link with you in the chat of where you can actually find your NDC on the NDC registry. So just on the next slide. So at Save the Children, together with the Global Partnership for Education, we recently launched this new guidance, which is focused on education, but I think a lot of it is really relevant for the ECD community. And it basically provides some of the different entry points, processes on how to integrate education into these NDCs. And I've just taken a little bit from the guidance document, adapted some of it slightly so it's more suited to ECD. But I think, and again, I can put the link in the chat afterwards, I think a lot of it is very relevant to both sectors. So just on the next slide. As I mentioned, and each country is in a different stage of where they are in the NDC process. So we've given a number of different options for where your country might be. So if your country is at the beginning of updating the NDC, there are lots of opportunities. If the country is in the process of updating the NDC, there is still some time. And then options 3 and options 4 are really looking at whether the country is already right towards the end of the NDC update, which means there might not be so much opportunity right now, or your NDC has actually been approved and endorsed already. But there's still time, even if your country has already submitted the NDC, because they might include sectors that are very relevant to ECD anyway, around health or education or adaptation, where you might then be able to support in the implementation of that NDC. And the other thing is looking at, okay, what were the lessons learned for this NDC update, and how might we already start looking towards 2030 to really try and lay the building blocks to make sure that ECD is then included in the next round of updates. So there's a huge range of options still available. On the next slide, these are some of the sections that you'll find in a nationally determined contribution, your national kind of climate policy. And there are opportunities to integrate ECD across any of these areas. So looking at both the kind of national circumstances, how are young children affected by climate change, really looking at their vulnerability, etc. Obviously looking at their responses to climate change and relevant sectors, links to other frameworks or policies, and this could include any policies linked to ECD that might already have climate change in. Then there are targets and indicators and other key areas. And on the next slide, you'll find some of the entry points for ECD that might be in an NDC. So one of them is around action for climate empowerment. This is the agenda article in the Paris Agreement that focuses on education and children's and youth engagement. So this is kind of the only place where children and education are mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And many countries will include action for climate empowerment in their NDCs as a result of this. Other sectors could be around adaptation. If your NDC is really looking at child rights or human rights, vulnerable populations, there is another entry point there. When looking at disaster and climate risk management, how do we ensure that ECD services remain open despite climate risks? Health, as we know, is a key entry point. Looking at industry and infrastructure in particular, so what infrastructure is available for those ECD services, and how might we be able to make sure that any mention of infrastructure, it currently is quite focused on health infrastructure, etc., or roads or industry. But we know that it goes beyond that, and that's really important for ECD to make sure that that infrastructure is adapting to climate change. And then there are other areas such as WASH or public awareness raising. So as you can see, there are a number of different entry points there for you to look at within your NDC and see if ECD could be integrated there. The second type of climate policy that is available at the national level is what's called the National Adaptation Plan. And these link very much with the NDCs, so ideally they would be aligned. But the National Adaptation Plan is potentially a slightly longer process that enables countries to identify and address their medium and long-term priorities for adapting to climate change. Again, these are led by national governments, they're country-driven, and it involves really looking at the vulnerability to impacts and then identifying evidence-based adaptation options. And it also needs to look at whether there are systems and capacities in place to actually undertake those adaptation actions, and look at how to include adaptation in a country's development planning, decision-making, and budgeting. And integrating climate change adaptation into sectors' development planning is one of the main objectives of the NAP process. So you can see how getting involved in the National Adaptation Plan process really links with the ECD policy processes and budgeting as well. So there are some synergies there that would be really important to explore further. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put this slide up again so why is this important? Finance, additional resources, implementation, and raising that importance and building the evidence base. And I'm just going to do a bit more of a deep dive now into climate finance, which is very linked with the climate policies that I just mentioned. Next slide, please. So what is climate finance? I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this before. Maybe you're already engaged in it and accessing it. But the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, describes it as local, national, or transnational financing that is drawn from both public, private, or other alternative sources of financing that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. Originally, in the Paris Agreement, there was a target set for $100 billion per year of climate finance from 2020 to 25, with rich polluting countries volunteering the most as the biggest polluters. As you might have guessed, the target was vastly underachieved. However, at COP29, there was a real push to increase the amount of money per year because we know that the response to climate change is going to cost us in the trillions. And so a new collective quantified goal on climate finance was decided, looking at 300 billion per year annually by 2035. If you go through to the next slide, please. So you can see here just some of the different types of climate finance that can be accessed. So under this UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they established a financial mechanism to basically look at providing financial resources to country parties that are really on the forefront of the climate crisis. So looking at small island developing states, least developed countries, etc. And so there are a number of different operating entities here. One of them is the Global Environment Facility, or the GEF, the Green Climate Fund, and then a number of special funds such as the Adaptation Fund, the newly created Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund. So these are a number of different climate finance funding schemes under the UNFCCC that countries can access to adapt and mitigate climate change. Next slide, please. And if you just skip through to the, yeah, lovely. So within the Green Climate Fund, for example, if I just zero in on one of these funds as an example, you can see that there are 8 result areas. So 4 of them are really looking at mitigation on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking more at resilience and adaptation. And this is where I think there are some really good entry points for ECD. When we're looking at health and well-being, food and water security, we know the relevance there to early childhood care and development and the importance of health and well-being for the youngest children. And then looking at most vulnerable people and communities, there is a real push to include children, youth, to look at sectors such as education, to really advance gender equality. But we often see the youngest children are missing when people talk about those vulnerable people and communities. So I feel like there is a lot more that can be done to raise awareness with some of these climate finance mechanisms of why the youngest people in society should be involved in climate financing. And it might seem logical to us, but we need to also highlight the climate rationale. So how climate change is impacting those young children and their caregivers, mothers, families, etc. And come up with the climate rationale so that it is really, really clear, based on science, based on evidence, so that it's more easily accessible. It's more easy to access climate finance. And then we already mentioned infrastructure and the built environment. So I just want to end by saying that the reason that I've kind of linked climate finance and climate policies together is because if ECD is included in those nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, when you're then trying to access climate finance, the case has already been made of why that should happen. So it will make accessing climate finance much easier if we're able to really support national climate policy processes. And with that, I'll end there, and thank you very much and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Jess. And yes, stay with us through our next panel, which I'll introduce in a second. But I want to just say how excited I am. Adrienne gave us a rationale and some concrete examples. Jess just walked us through the process that you can join with others within your country and really make a difference in this planning process. It's never too late. I can say that. Advocacy is a long-term effort. And so wherever you enter, and she gave us many entry points, I think the goal here is to get started. So let me introduce our great panel and ask Jess and Adrian to also come back for some discussion. We're really excited to turn to some country-specific examples now, and we have a wonderful panel, and I'll introduce all three of our new speakers. Bavreen Kandari, who is the founder of Warrior Moms in India, will be joining us. Then we'll also have Shamiso Mutisi, who's a Zimbabwean environmental lawyer with the Zimbabwean Environmental Lawyers Association. We're very excited to have him here because it's not just the changing climate, it's also environmental justice, and he brings that perspective. And finally, we'll be joined by Karma Galag, who is a specialist in the Ministry of Education in Bhutan, to get that government perspective. So please turn on our cameras and join us. Let me start with Bavreen. You have been advocating around climate issues in India for several years now. What's been the most successful from your perspective? And tell us a little bit in this about Warrior Moms and how important parents are in this effort. So over to you, Bavreen. You're on mute. We're all.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. John. It's always lovely to hear you and all the, earlier panelists. It's really an honor always to be speaking and discussing, learning so much, that early childhood development is something that has really come up, amongst all of yourselves, that we as moms have taken up and we realized in our work. So starting, I'll go back like what you've introduced me as Warrior Moms. We are mothers across the country in India who are working on clean air for our children. So we push policy and we work on advocacy, etc., various ways to be heard and be relevant and push the urgency that it's for. And until recently, we also, pushed, children as children and adults as adults. And we didn't kind of give so much importance to early childhood development, which we've learned amongst many here at Egden and RNEC, that we were doing a study, a micro-research study with RNEC, where when on the ground, we were working on household cooking, that we were seeing how the pollution is affecting the family. So when we realized that it was as a family that that harm or the PM 2.5, what its effect was on the family was not as much as the little ones, the 0 to 5 and 6 and 7 years, which was absolutely the results clearly showed how they were much more affected. So, because when you say children in my country also, you generally tend to think, you include even the teenagers and the 12-year-olds and 10-year-olds, but here there were these children who were, going to the doctors every week and every 10 days. So, so this was a realization, and India is like, of course, coming to like, we are, because of a population, we are home to over 160 million children under the age of 6. And this, of course, faces these unique challenges. And now connecting, of course, we work on clean air and we work on climate action and the climate change. So, now speaking like Dr. John said, that we work on the ground and with the grassroots. Now, there's a mom, a co-warrior mom, who was working in one of the states where fishing took a hit because of the climate crisis. So that was their work. So they migrated along with the children to, a city like Delhi, and where they took roles of daily wage workers. They were doing construction work. So when we were doing this construction, we were working with the construction moms. We were doing advocacy with them, showing them monitors and showing the PM10 and how all the construction dust affects them. we realized that they all these how they had come here. So they had these little 1 2-year-old and say one 5.5-year-old who had migrated. Now they didn't have a school, they didn't have a besides the basic nutrition, all the other basic requirements which a child under 6 should have, and their development is so slow because they are just on the site doing, and they've migrated. They don't have even permanent homes. And now came a season that we had air pollution, a construction ban in the city. Now, within a span of 3 or 4 days, they just again migrated. I mean, because they didn't even probably have money, so the little one phone numbers that we had, that they probably could never recharge it. And I still don't know till today. This is about 3 years ago, and we never knew where they went. So this is just an example to say that how climate change is affecting the children, especially because these children will have a very disastrous future of not having the right whether it is the food, the nutrition, or guidance, or the health that they deserve. So these impacts are profound, and disproportionately they affect our youngest citizens. And unfortunately, like many of my co-panelists just spoke, and very well in extremely good words that I cannot match up to, but national climate policies have pretty much historically overlooked the specific needs of young children and the caregivers, because that's exactly, like I said, that we are equally guilty, because we were not talking about it for a long time. And now coming to the as moms and seeing this happen, we are looking always to bridge that gap, that is the ECD and the climate policy. And of course, for us, coming to the solution part of it, that like we have the National Action Plan on climate change, then you have these respective state action plans, which explicitly incorporate various factors. So to push the ECD considerations, which are happening, I cannot say that they don't have, none of them. Some of them have, but now it is putting them specifically, like the child health, the nutrition, education services, the resilience to climate impacts. Now, last year, just about we were having before the general elections, we have another moms in Madhya Pradesh who had to visit about 80 kilometers away to get some medicines, and both her little children died on the way of heat impact. They lost, they got dehydrated, and both of them died, both the girls. Now, why? Because there was no knowledge or no availability. Maybe they just needed those salts with them, that could have helped them. So these are some things that are very, very important. Now, in our government, we have programs like it's called, some programs are called on the Nutrition Portion Abhiyan. There was this Anganwadi, Saksham Anganwadi, and these can be easily aligned with the climate initiatives. For example, maybe a solar-powered Anganwadi center, or a rainwater harvesting systems in where on schools, etc., where there is a shortage of water. In fact, there's shortage of water now everywhere, even in the urban setups. But we don't care. We buy water, but that's not the case with the most of the population. So all these, so it can serve dual purposes of child development and environmental sustainability. That eventually helps our children and the younger children who really need this.
Well,
and
thank you.
Sorry.
I'm going to move us on. So it's so exciting to see warrior moms. We are moms, we're grandmoms, we're grandfathers, fathers. We want to be warriors for peace and warriors for climate. And I'm going to come back to you at one point, Praveen, and ask you if other countries want to organize or link with parent groups, how will they do that? But I'll come back to you. I want to move us on to the lessons that Shimiso has learned in advocating at the national level. So Shimiso, can you tell us a little bit about your work in Zimbabwe, and what are the lessons that you've learned that you want to share with others? And I'll be back to you, Praveen.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks everyone for joining. Let me also thank the previous speakers as well for ably putting across a very strong case in terms of what's happening on the ground. I'm working with the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, so we are a public interest environmental law group. We promote environmental justice in Zimbabwe. So we have also been programming on child rights issues, and in particular, trying to promote environmental justice and climate justice. We have been doing this with what we call the E-clubs or environmental clubs at schools, could be primary schools, which include ECD, A and B. Those are like your 2-year, 3-year-olds. And then we also touch on the secondary schools and universities through our E-clubs. However, access to the younger generation, and in fact, the youngest of the young, has not been easy. Sometimes they are just excluded from these kind of processes, maybe because the teachers may feel that they are too young to be given certain information that may be not consumable to them at that level. But I'm aware that in some cases, we have had situations where the teachers have designed programs and messages that resonate with the younger ones. But our work as an organization is around public education on environmental rights that are there in the Constitution. And the Constitution also provides for the rights of the children. And the best interest of the children is one of the key principles in the work that we do. So as a result, we have gone around different schools, providing schools with pamphlets. We've also provided schools with easy to read information on the environmental rights that are there in the Constitution and the law. And at the same time, we've also participated in programs with UNICEF, TDH, and Save the Children, generally to talk about the UN General Convention number 26. We have been involved in advocating for children's rights and the environment, with an emphasis definitely on environmental justice from our perspective. And what do we mean? We are talking about the right of children to be protected from any climate-caused harm or environmental related harm. We need to make sure that the children are protected, and also even the issues around state obligations to take measures to protect the children from climate harm. We've had a situation where at some point we had an El Nino-induced heavy rains in the eastern part of Zimbabwe. So that caused a lot of floods, a lot of displacement of communities, and children ended up suffering without access to food, access to shelter, and all the basics as a result of climate change-induced floods. So a lot of communities and a lot of children were affected. They could not go to school and things like that. So we came in with a rights-based perspective to try and make sure that the rights of those children are protected. But what we also have in Zimbabwe in terms of policy, if I can also just provide some insights on policy issues, we have our NDCs. Zimbabwe was one of the first countries, I think, in Africa to submit its NDCs this February. And the NDC for Zimbabwe provides for integration of climate change into basic and higher levels of education. So by basic levels of education, we are talking about the primary level education, where ECD classes are also taking place. So this means climate change have to be integrated into the lower levels of education. So even our National Adaptation Plan 2024 has got an element around education and awareness. But I'm saying my point now is this may not be enough. You find that it's just a single paragraph or two that is not very, very specific on how that can be done and how it should be done. So I think there's need for us to improve on our laws. I'm involved in the drafting of a climate change bill for Zimbabwe, which definitely refers to the rights of children as well as youth to participate in decision-making processes. So we have included some provisions, not very perfect, but I think it's a good starting point that in practice then we can improve on. As for the lessons, so that I wind up and give others a chance, as a lesson, one of the key things that I think is important for early childhood development practitioners is to actively participate in legal reforms or policy processes, because normally they are underpinned by consultations. So we should take advantage of public consultation to attend and advance ECD-related principles when it comes to climate change. So that's another opportunity that I've identified, and I'll be happy to link up with some people with good information and good knowledge on this. Then also even the aspect of curriculum development. As we develop curricula for young kids, we need to make sure that we insert climate change related messages. So I'll stop there so that we can
Great.
have more information. But maybe before I stop, sorry for this, I also thought, nowadays in Zimbabwe, children are a conveyor of information. In Zimbabwe, parents are now doing a lot of homework, given homework by the teacher. So the kid is given homework by the teachers, go and do this. So I think if our teachers can give those children homework, it means we can send the message even to the parents. So that's my last message. Thank you.
That's great advice. And you said so many important things. I want to make sure, Shimiso, you might be able to put in the chat. We want to make sure that the early childhood groups link with the legal community in their countries. So any advice you can give us when you come back or in the chat about how does an early childhood national network they're emerging around the world, how do they link with the legal community so that they're advocating for General Comment 7, which is on early childhood, to General Comment 76, as you mentioned, the right to a clean environment. So I think you can give us a lot of advice along the way. Let me turn to our final speaker here, Karma Galag, on the panel. We'll come back later to the path to COP. But Karma, you've been such an amazing advocate within government in Bhutan around linking climate and early childhood. What's your advice? Tell us a little bit about what happened in Bhutan, what's happening in Bhutan, and your advice to the audience about how you reach out to the ministries, especially the Ministry of Education, and linking them with who's responsible for climate. So over to you, Karma.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Joan. This is a thoughtful question, which allows me to highlight Bhutan's journey in the integration of early childhood development and climate action through a governance lens. I would like to share what has worked for us, the lesson learned, and suggestions for countries similar to ours. In terms of the strategies that proved effective for us, I would like to first acknowledge the groundbreaking role of a catalyst, which in our case has been ARNIC. The catalytic role that ARNIC played, particularly through the Climate 101 workshop in 2024 and continued follow-up support, was pivotal. The workshop provided a foundational framework to develop an action plan and embed climate into ECCD programs, demonstrating how climate change action aligns with nurturing resilient future generations. ARNIC's continued support thereafter ensured sustained momentum, enabling us to turn ideas into action. The second factor that has worked for us is the centrality of multi-sectoral collaboration in breaking silos between health, education, environment, and local governments. For example, Care Bhutan, a local non-government community-based organization played a pivotal role in connecting social and environmental stakeholders, bringing us to the same table to enlighten us on the urgency of climate change and what the sector is doing in terms of policies and strategies, while allowing us to voice our concerns related to the impact of climate change on children and education particularly not being included in their agenda and narratives. This is how we came to agree that education and ECD should be featured in the NDC 3. Now, our NDC 3 will be out by September only. So we have what we have there with education as a whole, with focus also on early childhood development. The third critical factor was sustained contribution of development partners. In our case, UNICEF has been supporting the government from the outset and continues to do so, while local government and civil society drives engagements across different levels of society. The fourth factor was our ability to align with national policies. As such, our policies are interrelated and enabling. Our strategy in this regard aligns with the national priorities, particularly with overarching policies such as the gross national happiness, ensured cultural relevance, and enabled buy-in from policymakers and other stakeholders. For example, GNH, or gross national happiness, identifies ECD as a critical aspect of social development and well-being, and climate change as a vital aspect of environment conservation. To integrate these, we emphasized environment education and climate change as being integral to holistic child well-being and development, directly aligning with Bhutan's climate stewardship commitments in the NDC. So these are the effective strategies. In terms of the lessons, when you reflect on our journey that we learned, we have three key lessons to share with others, particularly in terms of government taking leadership. Government leadership is non-negotiable. Policy frameworks such as Bhutan's NDC, the National Education Policy, provided authority and legitimacy and scalability of programs. So ministries must champion cross-sector mandates to align these priorities. So this we did, and we have somehow been able to begin such an initiative and continually progressing. The second lesson was the role of networks in amplifying impact. Professional networks offered expertise, while social and community networks ensured local ownership. Regular dialogues between central and local governments maintained coherence between the central and the local governments. The third one is adaptability, which is critical. Because climate change evolves, so policies must also remain flexible. So these are the three key lessons that we learned. In terms of advice or suggestions for ECD advocates in strengthening advocacy measures, we would like to say that in our journey of advancing climate action within the early childhood sector, we have learned that effective advocacy requires strategic and thoughtful approaches, where key lessons include aligning with government policies, building unconventional alliances. In our case, for example, partnering with sectors such as health, agriculture, environment, the private sector, and civil society. The third advice would be leveraging global as well as local synergy. In our case, connecting local actions with global frameworks for greater impact and credibility. So here we highlighted SDG 4 and tried to connect it with 13, which is climate change. And And also, an important aspect is investing in sustained advocacy. I think one-time advocacy is never enough. So you have to keep pushing this agenda forward so that it sinks in with people at various levels. So this is how we have actually been successful in a way that we have begun and still continuing our efforts to ensure that climate change, as reflected in the NDC 3, is carried forward in terms of integrating in early childhood programs, both in terms of curriculum, capacity building, and all aspects of the program. So this is basically what we have learned in terms of our endeavors related to integrating early childhood and climate change. So within all of these efforts, we stand today really grateful to ARNEC for its leadership in facilitating not just cross-country exchange and collaboration, but also engaging with us in terms of individual countries, which is really powerful. And we hope ARNIC will continue to do so. And with this, again, thank you, Joan and Egdan, for providing this platform to share our experience. Thank you.
For your leadership and a special shout out from me to ARNEC too. The regional network, the Asia Pacific Regional Network, has provided incredible leadership, has wonderful tools. We'll put the link in the chat, and I encourage you to look at those fact sheets they have and some of the examples. You know, anything you can do to bring the ministries that are responsible for those sustainable development goals and together with the people that are planning education policy, that's our goal. And I think Bhutan has done that so beautifully. I want to just make sure that I get back to some of you. I know that Jess and Adrienne, if you could also come on camera, and what did you hear in this that you want to reinforce? If you could just provide brief comments, each of you. I'll turn to Adrienne, then Jess. I want to also come back to Praveen and ask for any final advice on reaching out to those mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandparents, and bringing them into our long-term efforts. But a few minutes of reflection, Adrienne.
First of all, this is great. I haven't been in a webinar for a while, and this is an excellent opportunity. And I see so many people. This is, again, I am over the moon that the community is growing so much on this topic. I think I want to go back to Babrin's point that we don't talk about, like we gave up on talking about the importance of ECD. And even in this webinar, we have been talking about a couple of areas of ECD, education, care, but we haven't really been talking about the nurturing care framework. And this is really important because I've been using the term grown-up policy matters lately to talk about the areas of the SDGs that do not obviously refer to early childhood development, like water, like cities, like energy, like all of those grown-up areas. Climate change are the areas that concentrate the most fiscal financing in countries. And we need to be present in those policy-making efforts, like Karma was pointing out, and we need to become embedded in those efforts, and we need to keep insisting on the value that we bring to those efforts, so that in all of those areas of policy, ECD is interwoven. Not that we are doing advocacy for it, because one of the beauties of what's happening in the Pacific, and the reason that ECD was included in the NDC in the Marshall Islands and will be included in other NDCs, is because the climate teams recognize now that we are an important part of the achievement of their goals. We have to meet their policy goals where they are at. We can't keep going there expecting them to believe our narrative about vulnerability, and that will in itself create the conditions for us to be taken care of. We need to really elevate the value we bring to their agenda. The climate negotiations, what is the value we bring to that agenda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just really want to remind us, we have value to bring to this conversation. And while we are anxious and we believe that we understand the vulnerability, there have been a lot of comments about the vulnerability. The policy, the grown-up policy process doesn't care about our vulnerability as much as they are eager to get tools to solve their problems. And we have tools. Let's use them smartly in the policy process.
Thank you again, Adrian, for your continued message about the value that we bring and the nurturing care framework as a way for us to build resilience in children and in linking with the climate community to send that message that we bring value. We have to balance, right, the things that we're hearing about how negatively the changing climate and the environment has been affecting children with this value. And I think that's been our next message all along. But Jess, a few comments before we close this panel out. I'll come back to you, Praveen, and then move to our final speaker. Jess.
Yeah, sure. I'll be very quick because it'll be great to hear from Barine again. So for me, there's kind of three things that have come up. One, which is the kind of providing of evidence, the evidence-based piece around not only why younger children are vulnerable to climate change and the climate rationale, but also the main thing that Adrian just mentioned of the role that ECD plays in taking climate action, in promoting climate action and advancing the goals within the Paris Agreement. The second is around coordination. So coordination across sectors. I think there was a question in the chat that I saw that there are a number of different sectors now getting more and more involved in national climate policies, and it ends up sometimes feeling like a competition. But we know ECD by its very nature is multi-sectoral. It links in with so many different sectors. So we really need to be coordinating, but also coordinating with those ministries responsible for climate change. And the third point is really just understanding and identifying those entry points in national climate policy processes that link with current existing development processes in Bhutan, the happiness index, etc. Like really try and link in with those that are already there and find those entry points in the NDCs and NAPs. So it's not necessarily seen as something new, but linking with existing national policies. So evidence, coordination, and national policies. Thank you.
Well, Jess, and thank you for providing us an understanding of those entry points. I think we're going to come back to that entry point thinking as we move this along. So thank you for that. Final word, Shimiso has been nice enough to put his email in the chat to help us link with the legal community. So I want to thank him for that. And Praveen, any final word before I move it on to our final speaker? I wish we had more time.
No, a quick, yes, absolutely. Like you said, I think parents are very, very important in this whole battle that we're all fighting for our children. And and then also a common link that we have with the politicians, the policymakers, the decision makers, that they are parents too. So I think that emotion that we can connect. And I just shared one article recently that was done on Women's Day. There are so many parent movements across the world who are doing, whether they're knitting and embroidery with love, with even with fighting, direct action, baking cakes. There are many ways of messaging, and you could find a group nearby. And Our Kids Climate is one of the, again, amazing, a group, a global group. So please join. And yes, that's the way we can bring the change. Thank you, Dr. John.
Great. We're going to send out some linkages for Warrior Moms, Our Kids Climate, Moms Clean Air Force, and so many other groups. So we really want to send the message to the early childhood, linking with parents, linking with lawyers and the legal community, linking with the education ministries. We've gotten important messages here. So please join me in thanking the panel. We're hoping we have some time at the end for questions, but I know that We're putting a lot of resources in the chat. We hope you access them. And Brett and I are always here to answer questions as follow-up. Thank you to our panel. I'm going to turn to our last speaker, very important, to hear from Leticia Carvalho from the Alana Institute. And I want to do a special shout out, Leticia, to the Alana Institute and for all the advocacy that you have been doing to raise the visibility of child rights and the importance of young children in the COP process. We know that COP30 is coming to Brazil and that you're going to take every opportunity to raise the visibility of young children. So I know you're on mute now. If you could come off mute and share with us the road to COP30.
Thank you, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. So I'm here representing Alana Institute. We are a Brazilian-based global organization, and we work to promote children's rights. And considering the path to COP30, what I would like to emphasize is that the conversations here in Brazil are centered around, maybe you heard about it, but they are centered around the logistic challenges of hosting COP30, as it will take place in the Amazon region. But at the same time, there is a strong expectation for an inclusive COP that represents diverse voices. Many topics will be discussed with a particular focus on advancing the agenda on climate finance, just transition, and adaptation. But our main goal is to ensure that the mainstreaming, what we are calling as mainstreaming child rights throughout the COP30 discussions and the entry points that Jess mentioned here earlier. So it's worth mentioning as well that the COP30 presidency is very open to the topic of child rights and ECD. We have already established a very positive dialogue with them. Also, we recently held a meeting where we presented recommendations, which I will share here with you. Also, it is important to note that within the COP, the child rights agenda only recently started to be considered after 32 years. Some key milestones include the creation of the Children and Youth Pavilion, a space where this topic, this agenda is discussed the whole COP, but also the expert dialogue on children and climate change held last year in Bonn during the what we call as pre-COP. Also, we have IUNGO. IUNGO is the official Children and Youth Constituency of the UNFCCC. And IUNGO has been working to highlight these unique vulnerabilities of children and to strengthen their representation as well. So, as you all know, early childhood and children are deeply and disproportionately affected by climate change due to their unique stage of development. And we believe that the Brazilian presidency is and its leadership at COP30 represent a crucial opportunity to advance this agenda. So our recommendations focus on three key areas. The first one is negotiations, the second, participation, and the third one, communication. So considering negotiations, what we recommend is that the COP30 presidency ensure the continuity of this expert dialogue on children and climate change that happened last year. And also, what we want is to mainstreaming child rights into all negotiations tracks, all entry points. Considering participation, we propose, for example, just to emphasize that last year was created a new mandated in COPs in general. The name is President's Youth Climate Champion. And what we are trying to do is to help this PYCC to facilitate an official listening process that actively engages children and not be restrict to youth, because this is one of our main challenges when we are talking about these topics in this topic in the UNFCCC. And when we are talking about ECD, is even more challenging when we are talking about participation. So the third recommendation that we made is related to communication. So we suggested the production of accessible, inclusive, and child-friendly versions of every decision agreed upon at COP30, but also we propose creating a dedicated space where the negotiation happens, where content produced by children, such as videos, drawings, can be continuously showcased, and as a way to amplify their voices and their way of expressions and experience and their proposals for climate action. So also, what we recommend is to have these safe spaces for moms, for example, so they could be there in a safe space, in a child-friendly space as well. So just to summarize, these are our main recommendations related to negotiation, participation, and communication. Also, we are trying to, here in Brazil, but also with partners, we are trying to organize high-level events so we can ensure that this topic gains visibility within the COP30 action agenda as well, because we are not only talking about negotiations, but the action agenda is very important. And to finalize, I don't know if I have how much time I have, but what I would like to emphasize is that we already have, for example, the General Comment 26, we already have the results from the expert dialogue on children and climate change that happened last year. So what we are trying to do right now is to move beyond formal mentions on early childhood or children in general in the documents, but try to promote a substantive integration of children's rights into these negotiation tracks. And mainly what we're trying to do is to recognize, for example, is to emphasize that we already have a convention on the rights of the child that recognize the principle of the best interests of child as a primary consideration. And this must be a primary consideration in all climate decisions as well. So we are trying to build this connection between the convention, the UNFCCC, but also the CRC, because we already have this strong international document that emphasize the primary consideration and the best interest of the child. And we have the general comment on early childhood as well. So we are trying to build these bridges and show the countries and the parties that they are already committed with an international agreement through the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we need to bring this into climate negotiation as well. So,
So much.
thank you.
Second, you shared, I want to reiterate, General Comment 26, General Comment 7, and we'll share those with everybody as a follow-up to make those links between and among the many documents. We've had so many agreements, now we have to put them to work. You said you're going to have pictures and voices. We've got a lot of people on the line from around the world. Can they feed into your process? I was sitting here thinking we should have a whole campaign about picture this and send pictures of children. They need a future, pictures that they draw. How do we get the voice of younger children into this? And is there a way that people that are listening, should they be sending things to their representatives before COP? What's your advice?
Yes, of course. Actually, we are trying to, right now, we are developing this campaign. So shortly, we're going to share with you how you all could help. First of all, we were thinking about letters from children from around the world, mainly, of course, from Brazil, considering the logistics, but it would be very important to spread this around the world. But drawings also could be a way to listening young children. So shortly through John, through Brett, I'll share this call with you.
Okay, and for any of the speakers, I mean, Jess, if people are thinking about how do they find out who is going to COP from their country, is there any advice that you have on that process? I know you mentioned that you could find the national plans. You had a link to that, but what about if I'm in a country and I have no idea who's going to Brazil? How do I find out?
Yeah, great question. My first point of call would probably be on the UNFCCC website. There is a list of national climate focal points, and I can put that in the chat as well. Otherwise, I would say, yeah, reaching out through relevant ministries, networks, those liaising with the ministries of environment, ministries responsible for climate change. Most countries will be sending, or they will be sending delegations. Obviously, they vary in size. Some are enormous and some are very, very small. But yeah, I would probably recommend first looking on the UNFCCC website for those different focal points. There are also the Action for Climate Empowerment focal points, which, as I mentioned, includes the process around children and youth engagement and education. And so those lists are available as well. So that's something like easily available online, beyond the kind of in-country networks that you might already have.
Great, and I think that we'll try to provide those linkages. Brett, I'm promising a lot of linkages here, but I think it's really important for follow-up. Before I turn it back over to Brett, I don't know if we have further questions coming in, Brett?
I wanted to point, John,
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
we've been talking about COP30, and a lot of the discussion in COP30 is really the follow-up to what is just coming up, which is the SB62, which is the mid-year meeting, which usually happens in Bonn. This year it will be from the 16th to the 26th of June. And this is really important because this is the place where a lot of the decisions are made of what is going to be discussed and taken care of in COP30. COP30 is more of a protocolary event for most part. So if you can find out as soon as possible who are the people in your country involved in the climate negotiations, they are actually going to be doing the hard work in June 16 to the 26th in Germany. So whatever is not whatever is not put on the table there is not likely to be put on the table in Brazil. So keep that date in mind as well.
That's really good advice. There is a midpoint where representatives from countries gather. So this is a drumbeat. We have to make sure that we send our messages during that meeting at midpoint and at COP, and then after and leading up to it. I'm going to turn it back to Brett, but I want to say just one or two final things. You know, you can't do this alone. If you're sitting and listening, you have to join with others, especially when you're trying to influence the national level, even in your community. This is, as Karma said, it's about joining with others and doing this in a cross-sector way. And, you know, Brett, one thing I've learned over the last few months is we don't give up. We do not give up. We have lots of work to do. We owe it to the children that we're caring for around the world. We want a clean, green, safe environment, a nurturing environment, and that's what we're going to continue to raise our voices around. Brett, over to you.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you so much. So as we close out, first, we want to hear from you. We want to understand what you need, how you're engaging in the climate agenda. You can email us at info@ecdan.org, but also Harper's my colleague. Can you share the second poll so that we can get some feedback and input from all of you as we close out?
Absolutely. I'm launching the second poll right now.
We'd love to hear how you're all engaging in advocacy and what is most important to you. So just as we close out, I wanted to highlight a few things. First of all, this was a great webinar. I share Adrian's excitement and enthusiasm that it feels like there's momentum behind ECD and climate change, and it feels like the community is growing. And that's exciting to see. And so, we've heard so much over this webinar about the importance of advocacy, the need to link early childhood development really as a key climate strategy, as a strategy that helps to achieve the objectives of the climate agenda and not just come with a problem, come with a solution. We've heard about ways to engage in national climate advocacy, and those entry points are so critical. And we've also heard about the importance of ensuring government's leadership, of building and connecting into strong coalitions, the need to continue consistently to engage policymakers and build commitment to early childhood development within these key entry points and policies and climate financing mechanisms. We've also heard about the importance of engaging with parents and community organizing and how to leverage child rights and legal advocacy as key strategies, as well as leveraging the nurturing care framework. And then, of course, we've heard some concrete policies in Zimbabwe, Bhutan, and Marshall Islands that are linking education and ECD into NDCs, which that's what we need to do. That's the importance. And finally, we've also heard about what's needed for COP30 and how we're able to, what's needed, but also how partners in Brazil are leading the charge, like Alana. So as we wrap up, I want to just share that what we've heard today really tracks with the conversations that we've had with early childhood development partners over the last couple of years. And from those conversations and consultations, I think a few common themes have emerged. First is, for many advocates working on early childhood, the climate space is a complicated one. I think we're often familiar with the education sector, with the health sector. The environmental and environmental justice sector is new and different for many of our partners. And so is the actual issue of climate change. It's technical, it's well established. It's new for many working in the early childhood development space. And that's why we're so thankful for partners like RNEC who are leading the charge and have been leading the charge on this. And then, the evidence is complicated, but it's still, and also still emerging, while we do have also at the same time a really strong evidence base. So how do you link that evidence base to the climate agenda, to these entry points that we've discussed? How do you develop really strong key messages that are going to resonate with those folks that come from the climate side of the agenda, the climate side of the coin, if you will? So this is all new to a lot of our partners. And so that's why we organized this webinar. And that's why we've created a new tool that we're calling the ECD Climate Advocacy Guide, which I've shared, and I'll share again in the chat. But what this tool does is really try to unpack those entry points for advocacy that Jess and that Adrian and others have shared. So what are those entry points, and how can you build partnerships and leverage those entry points to elevate early childhood development into those conversations? So we hope the tool is helpful. We'll share it through our social media platform, through email. We'll be developing new resources and tools, including one specifically focused on climate financing. And again, please don't hesitate to share with us the work that you're doing and what you need. Send us to info@ecdan.org. Send us an email to info@ecdan.org with your ideas and suggestions, and just to sort of look at where folks are actively engaged and what is most important, most interested in terms of your climate advocacy. What we're hearing is really at the national level, what are those opportunities to leverage climate financing for ECD? Again, we'll be sharing a new policy brief on just that, as well as those national level opportunities for advocacy, NDCs, national adaptation plans, et cetera. So the tool we'll be sharing, again, let me put that in the link in the chat. this does just that. It really tries to highlight those national level opportunities. So let me close with just a sincere thanks to our terrific panelists. I've learned a lot myself. I hope you will have too. And I hope that you found that this webinar has been helpful. I think our panelists have been really, really terrific. And these are the folks that are leading the charge. These are the folks that have the expertise and experience, and we're just thankful for them for sharing it with us today. So on that note, we're going to close out. Again, please don't hesitate to reach out to info@ecdan.org with ideas and questions, and we're going to continue to have these webinars and develop these tools to support your work at the country level. Thank you all. Bye-bye.